Hi, I'm Jeremy Kirk with Intel 471, and this is Happy Hunting, your guide to threat hunting in your logging systems. With me today is Senior Threat Hunt Analyst Lee Arkinall. How are you doing, Lee?
Great, Jeremy.
So Lee is soon going to demo a threat hunt for technique that was used related to the exploitation of on-premises SharePoint. Before we get into that threat hunt, I'm going to discuss briefly the background into the exploitation of SharePoint. So on July 8th, 2025, Microsoft patched two vulnerabilities in the on-premises version of SharePoint. One of those was a spoofing flaw, and the other was a remote code execution flaw. So these became known as the ToolShell flaws. Attackers began exploiting these vulnerabilities just before Microsoft released those patches, and it's believed that the information related to those vulnerabilities might have leaked through a Microsoft program called the Microsoft Active Protections Program. Under that MAP program, vendors get a heads up as to what vulnerabilities Microsoft's going to patch, and so they can write their own detections and also tweak their own products. But to make matters worse, after Microsoft patched, it was found that those patches were not actually complete. And so there were two other related flaws that attackers began exploiting, one of which was the deserialization of untrusted data flaw, and the other a path transversal flaw. The attackers were, in some cases, using the flaws to install web shells. They could get access to machine keys on SharePoint servers, which could also allow for remote code execution. And there were at least 400 systems that were affected by this, dozens of organizations. These were some of the most significant vulnerabilities of the year due to the products affected and also the mass exploitation that happened. So afterwards, once the mass exploitation happened, Microsoft released a blog post afterwards with some attribution information. So they said that two nation-state Chinese APT groups were exploiting these ToolShell flaws. One was Linen Typhoon and the other Violent Typhoon. Linen Typhoon has been focused on stealing intellectual property since around 2012. It also targeted defense, strategic planning, and human rights organizations. Violent Typhoon goes back to at least 2015 and usually has a cyber espionage agenda. So there was also a third group that Microsoft said called Storm 2603 that was using the flaws to install the Warlock ransomware. And since then, there have been other ransomware-related activity observed. So with that, I'll turn it over to Lee, who's going to walk us through a threat hunt related to some ToolShell exploitation behavior. Take it away, Lee.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. So ToolShell is exploiting something similar. Now, it's a different CVE, but there's a behavior that we can track that is associated with this and past other exploits whenever it comes to similar activity. So let me show you what I'm talking about. So if we wanted to hunt and see what we have available in the Hunter platform for this ToolShell, we can find it very easily. First off, let's just do a quick search, ToolShell. Then we'll jump into the Hunt package collections. And we're going to use this top hit right here. So the CVE 2025-53770, Microsoft SharePoint Mass Exploitation. So you can see the list of Hunt packages that capture behaviors associated with this. One that's really interesting is this right here, the suspect child process to IIS Worker Process. And we're going to jump into that and see what we can find. So Jeremy provided us a lot of information about the threat group and the past behaviors, but let's take a look at it on a technical level. So if we scroll down, first thing we're going to look for is the description. And we see that this package is intended to identify abnormal child processes to the Microsoft IIS Worker Process, which is w3wp.exe. So this is used to run web applications and is responsible for handling requests sent to web servers. So this is the first artifact that we can use to start getting our ideas about pivoting and hunting for this. Now, if we scroll down, start to take a look at the research, we can see that this behavior was actually abused multiple times. Most of the time, it's related to different Microsoft Office products, exploiting different CVEs. This behavior was seen being exploited in Proxy Shell. We can see Clop Ransomware Gang was exploiting it whenever it was using the MoveIt vulnerability back in the day. But so we have all these CVEs that are showing up. But the real idea behind this is the commonality is the behavior that exists around this. So looking at that w3wp.exe, looking at that process being the parent process of other living off LAN binaries is a nice start. So in this example right here, and this is something that you can use to start with like an IOC scan, and I'll get to that in a second. But we can see an actual example of this. So Unit 42 report that a pink sandstorm leveraged the IIS Worker Process, and it launched a subsequent post-exploitation commands that was doing internal reconnaissance. So you can see these little commands being executed after or by w3wp.exe as the parent process. So we can see they were looking at the net user, their net user domain. They were looking at all these different things. That's the behavior. I know I keep saying behavior, but I want to talk about IOCs versus IOAs. So an IOC is like a point in time indicator. For example, looking at this example right here, this right here would be a point in time indicator or an indicator of compromise. That may change from campaign to campaign. Now, when we're talking about indicators of attack, we're talking about the relationship between artifacts that exist. And the main relationship we're talking about right now is the relationship between w3wp.exe being the parent process of some abnormal child processes that are most likely tied to living off the land binaries. Now, this intel right here is great because you can look at the relationships and you can run queries based on this, like juicypotatong.exe, IISLPE.exe. These are all file names that you could use to search for in your environment. If you were to look for this relationship, you might miss it because they may have changed these payloads or the names of the payloads and gone on to something else. Now, if you catch it in time within like a 30, 60, 90-day window of a campaign and you want to say, hey, this just came out, everyone look for juicypotatong.exe in our environment, great. Past that window, if you don't think you're being targeted, you might not really focus on Juicy Potato, but you might focus straight on the behavioral hunt, which focuses on w3wp.exe spawning all these command prompts, right? That's what the relationship and that's the behavior and that's the indicators of attack that we're talking about. I like to call IOAs, I sometimes shorten it to artifacts, simply because that's how I operate. But you can see all this intel that we provide, all the context. I mean, in this example, we got a whole PowerShell encoded command that was executed after, and I'm going to stop because you can see that the slider is very small. So that's just probably a ginormous PowerShell encoded command. But most recently, updated 8/28/2025, we see another command line argument that can be hunted or can be searched for in your environment. So if you were to take this and treat it like an IOC, you would copy paste this whole thing in your environment and say, go. If it didn't show up, which is most likely not to, because they're changing their indicators of compromise per attack, then the idea is to say, all right, well, let's look at the behavior of w3wp.exe. I know that was a lot, but what that boils down to is this. We've identified multiple living off land binaries that have been abused in the past, or things that we've added to say this would be substantial if an adversary would actually use it, with being the parent process of w3wp.exe. So we're setting up as the parent process contains w3wp.exe and any of these different child processes, command.exe, PowerShell, bitsadmin, net, and so on. So we've crafted that relationship for you. You can go back to the Intel reports, which I encourage you to do so. Find the indicators of compromise. Run those through your environment. Look for those quick wins. But if you don't find any or have any results, come here, come to Hunter, check out the behavioral hunt, and then get hunting for it. So we're going to use Splunk as we usually do here. So let's actually see what this query looks like and let's look at the results that we have in the tool. So as you can see, we ran our query, we ran our emulation on the back end as well. And really what the emulation does is it validates that the query is working by generating the traffic or the activity needed or in the event logs that are needed to validate this query that it actually works. So what we see is, once again, looking at our endpoint index, looking at when event logs specifically, and then we have the creator process name, which is w3wp.exe, which can be translated as the parent process. And new process name is in this list. So like we mentioned before, command.exe, PowerShell.exe, bitsadmin. and so on. And then we've aggregated enough so that, if there are multiple events or unique events that are tied to this, we'll be able to see that as well. But what we see is, looking at the results, we see the creator process is w3p.exe. The child process is command.exe, and that was the command line. Of course, this is our emulation. So yes, this validated that it worked, but you may find some more interesting things in your environment. Now, some interesting things that you might want to look at is right here, this child process and the child process command line arguments. Those are some artifacts that could get really interesting really quickly and really provide some more intel into what the intent of the adversary is and what they're going after. So if you see command.exe, like we saw in the example of Hunter, doing some discovery queries, you might think that, hey, we're looking at reconnaissance. But if you start seeing like registry key modifications or network connections being made surrounding this, then there's some things that you can start thinking about. You can start thinking about C2. You can start thinking about persistence. There's a lot of different ways you could go. But like I said, this is the behavior that is associated with ToolShell and the CVE that was released recently. And the fact that this has been used time and time again with the exploitation of multiple CVEs gives us a good idea that this will continue to be a behavior that's used as it continues to keep working.
And
But
so, Lee, now that you
Yes.
found command.exe, then would the next step be to figure out what commands that the attacker or the suspected attacker entered then, and then follow those little trails down to see what they were doing?
Absolutely. Because those command line artifacts are really, really valuable, because that will reveal the code that they're executing in your environment. It could be anywhere from, like we saw, just, like ping.exe or net user, to that PowerShell encoded command that was obfuscated that you might have to do some more work and say, all right, well, where is this encoded command actually doing? But you could also look at process IDs. You can use time frame windows to look at, like, hey, let's look at this computer in this, couple minutes from here. There's a lot of ways to investigate it, but yes, finding those artifacts that will breadcrumb you through the investigation, it is very important.
Thanks.
Now, Brum, well, thank you for joining us, first of all. Second, I hope this was helpful. I hope it was insightful that you can take this information to start hunting for ToolShell in your environment using the suspicious child process to IIS Worker Process, w3wp.exe, potential exploitation, to find malicious or suspicious activity in your environment. We highly encourage you to check it out. You got the community edition at your hand. You can find the link down below in the video, and I hope you get home. Stay tuned for more episodes, but until then, happy hunting.